Chúng ta sẽ cùng tìm hiểu những xu hướng và kinh nghiệm quốc tế trong thúc đẩy tăng trưởng xanh và phát triển bền vững. Mở đầu phiên tham luận, chúng tôi xin được trân trọng giới thiệu ông Cyril Loisel, bí thư thứ nhất phụ trách chính sách khí hậu, môi trường và việc làm, phái đoàn Liên minh châu Âu tại Việt Nam với chủ đề đổi mới xanh và kinh tế tuần hoàn. Ông sẽ chia sẻ những kinh nghiệm và góc nhìn từ Liên minh châu Âu trong việc thúc đẩy tăng trưởng xanh, sử dụng hiệu quả tài nguyên và xây dựng nền kinh tế tuần hoàn. Xin trân trọng kính mời ông.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Nguyen Duc Hien, Deputy Chair of the Central Commission on Planning and Strategy, Mr. Le Chong Minh, Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Vietnam Investment Review, Mrs. Chan Thi Nong Ha, CEO of Viet Research, Mr. Michael Han, Vice Chair of COCHAM, Mr. Nguyen Viet Long, Deputy Director General of EY Vietnam. Thank you very much to Viet Research for the invitation. And like all of you, I very much look forward to hear about and recognize the leaders in Vietnam on innovation and sustainability. But before we do that, I want to share a few remarks about green innovation and sustainable economy as it relates to market demands and regulations. As we all know, the market wants more and more evidence of sustainability of activity of companies. And quite often, this is driven by legislation and regulations in the European Union, which drives companies to continue to be allowed to place products on the markets in the European Union. Then they request certain actions from their suppliers, including in Vietnam. So the main idea I want to develop is that adapting to regulatory changes should not just be seen as a defensive approach to protect market positions, but it should be seen as a way of promoting green innovation to create more value, access investment capital, and expand to new markets. So this is really an opportunity for leading companies to gain more markets, especially that with all these new rules, the big brands, they are really looking for suppliers that are able to follow the rules and demonstrate that they can do so. So I'll share a bit more about that, and I'll also say a few words about institutional instruments that we have to promote this agenda between the European Union and Vietnam. First, maybe just to put things in context, in the European Union, like in Vietnam, we're committed to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. And with that, we have point targets in 2030, 2035, 2040 as part of our international commitments under the Paris Agreement and also under our domestic legislation, the EU climate law. We just updated with a new commitment to do minus 90% emission reductions by 2040. So this is very demanding, but our economic research shows that it can be done. And importantly, it can be done with benefits to people in Europe and the European economy. But it has to be done carefully with focusing research in the right areas to make sure that we get on the right path and we do that in a cost-effective way. So with that comes a broad program, the European Green Deal and the Sustainable Finance Action Plan. I won't develop all of it, but I will highlight a few pieces of regulation as part of that comprehensive program, a few pieces of regulation that really affects companies in Vietnam. So to take a few examples, first, there's the EU deforestation regulation that has kept many people busy in recent years in here. It affects supply chains for timber, for coffee, for rubber, soybeans, etc. So it requires that if you place those products on the EU market, it has to be legal from the point of view of the country of origin, Vietnam, and it has to come from parcels that were not deforested after 2020. So it requires the supply chain to organize itself, to provide all the data, including geographical coordinates, attached to the products to be able to continue gaining access. And Vietnam has been very proactive on that one and is in a good position to expand its market position. We simplified the system to reduce the administrative burden, and now the system will come into operation at the end of this year, and I'm very confident that Vietnam can not only comply, but also benefit from the implementation of these rules. The second example is eco-design for sustainable products. What do we mean by eco-design? Quite many things. Initially, we started with energy labeling, and you have a similar system in Vietnam. If you go to an electronic store, aside of the appliances, you will have a green label that tells you about energy efficiency of the microwave oven, the television set, and so on and so on. We have a similar system in Europe, but in addition, it links to a QR code. And then if you check the QR code, it takes you online and you have a digital product passport when you can find all the information about the product. Not only that, but officers at the customs, they can have access to additional information. People who will recycle the products at the end of the life, they have access to other information to let them know what they can do with different parts of the products. So that is a vision that will expand over the years, and people anticipate that through the next decade, pretty much most of the products that will be sold in Europe will have their own QR code linking to a digital product passport somewhere online. We're starting with a few supply chains, textile, apparel, furniture, steel, tires, and so on. So those requirements will be in operation towards the end of this decade. They are being developed now, and there will be a lot of work together to test traceability systems and different requirements. We expect that for textile, for example, there should be also a requirement for including a share of recycled fiber into the new apparel that is produced. So a lot of work in front of us, but this is for the good of eco-design and sustainability of production, and an opportunity to get ahead of others and gain more market shares. Quickly, we have the Corporate Social Due Diligence Directive and also the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive. On reporting, this is for traded companies on stock exchange in the EU. They have to provide information on sustainability of their activities. And so indirectly, there's in fact quite few companies. There's about 1,000 companies not from the EU that have to implement that because they sell very large amount of products in Europe, and there's very few, maybe 2-3 Vietnamese companies that may be directly affected. But more importantly, quite many companies in Vietnam, they're the big brands that purchase from the Vietnamese companies. They require additional information to be able to fulfill their own commitment with regard to EU rules. So that may be, for example, Scope 3 emissions for greenhouse gas emissions, information on labor standards pursued, on the management of chemicals, and so on. So they need to provide that information to their clients so that the clients can comply. And similarly with due diligence directive, nowadays, starting July 2029, the big companies in Europe, if there is evidence of major trouble in their supply chains, they can be punished up to 3% of their annual turnover. And to prevent that, then they need to work with their suppliers to ensure. So sometimes they would offer a new code of conduct for their suppliers to work on human rights abuse, environmental violations, and so on. They may request additional documentation on overtime limits, chemical runoff, waste disposal, and so on and so on. And they may request monitoring of fair wages, no child labor, and so on and so on. So more information that come into the system to ensure that the final clients, they meet the requirements. CBAM, I won't develop that too much today. This is carbon border management adjustment mechanism. The enterprises in Europe, they've been implementing the emission trading system for more than 20 years now. And so they pay a price of nowadays around 80 euros per ton of CO2 emitted. And Vietnam is starting its own system, of course. But to prevent that the industries are not just moving away from Europe, to avoid paying the price on carbon in Europe. Then the system applies also to companies that are placing steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, and so on EU markets. So those products that are carbon intensive, but also highly exposed to international trade. So the system, there was a trial period that just ended, and now the system has come in operation at the beginning of this year. And well, now is not the place to get into the details of the CBAM rules. And then there are more regulations on forced labor, on packaging waste. For example, starting 2030, there will be a requirement that all packaging, plastic packaging of products that come into the EU market will have a certain share of recycled plastic that come into that. And then immediately there's a ban on the use of packaging that is not strictly necessary, such as wrapping around fruits, for example, that kind of things. So all of that, at first sight, it may appear like new burden, but it's also an opportunity to develop more markets. And so there is a very significant innovation agenda. To start with the energy transition, renewable technologies are now very mature on the Vietnamese market, solar energy, wind energy, and so on. But there are new renewables that come into play, offshore wind, geothermal, and then there are the grid, power grid solutions, high voltage direct current. There's more responses linked to electricity market design that will allow battery storage, for example, and also demand response measures to facilitate reduction of emissions from the power sector. On resource circularity and bioeconomy, I think everyone recognizes Vietnam as a major hub for green tech and upscaling applications, upcycling applications. It's largely driven by the regulation on extended producer responsibility, and it has allowed companies to flourish in the space of composite or biotech-based biomaterials, construction materials, alternatives to ordinary plastics for packaging, and so on. There are innovative systems to collect waste at the source, sort the waste, and then there's innovative applications. From my limited time here, I've seen some exciting new opportunities on byproducts from fisheries, from shrimp farming, into cosmetics, for example, but also reuse of cocoa pod or rice husk residues to do biochar, which can be used for fertilization. So quite many very exciting opportunities. And then there are the industrial symbiosis in industrial park, whereby some companies' waste may become input for other companies, or the water is recycled, and so on. Of course, there remains limitations on access to sorted waste streams, collecting farm residues, access to green finance, and so on. But I think there's great potential. On traceability, I mentioned eco-design for sustainable product passport. There's a lot of digital development to produce a digital product passport, and I think that will expand over the market over time. And on that, Vietnam is also very active in digital innovation. I'll stop that briefly. I want to mention a few instruments. Of course, earlier this year, you may have heard that we expanded the bilateral relation between the EU and Vietnam to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Of course, we have the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, Vietnam being the #1 trading partner of the European Union in the region, and that opens opportunities. Very recently, we are establishing a joint working group on environment and climate change to pursue that agenda together, and we just had a letter of intent to strengthen cooperation on science, technology, and innovation. So my commissioner, Zaharieva, on science and innovation was here last month to celebrate this new agenda. Green innovation is a key pillar of this joint agenda. Vietnamese universities are already participating in over 30 collaborative research programs across Europe, and we expand to multiply that and facilitate access of Vietnamese companies and universities to collaborative research across Europe. I should leave it at that for now. More information for anyone interested. And again, thank you very much, Viet Research, for the invitation And I look forward to see the nominees on innovation and sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank Mr. Cyril Loisel for your meaningful presentation today.